Let's dive into a topic that, well, might make you look at big crowds a little differently. Crowd safety.
Yeah, definitely a fascinating area.
We've got a whole stack of research here, some industry reports too, even case studies, you know,
Mm.
real world stuff.
It's interesting how crowd safety pulls from so many different fields. Like you've got engineering and psychology, even sociology.
And computer science is getting in on it too.
Absolutely.
But with crowds being, well, crowds so unpredictable, how can experts actually figure out how crowds behave?
It's definitely, it's not as simple as just counting how many people are there. It's way more complex.
Right.
Yeah. Crowd behavior, it's really intricate.
Yeah.
You think about it, every single person, they've got their own reasons for being there, their own reactions to things, their own background.
Right.
It makes it a lot harder to make a model of than something like traffic, with cars.
Yeah, actually, one of the papers we read pointed that out. They said crowds are harder to predict than traffic
Oh,
because
interesting.
people have more freedom to move around.
Right. Uh-huh.
And they're influenced by emotions, which can spread so quickly.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Like, think about trying to predict how, I don't know, a sudden rainstorm
Right.
or like the excitement at a concert. You know how those things can just ripple through a crowd
Yeah.
and just change how everyone acts in a way you totally didn't expect? That's the kind of complexity crowd scientists have to deal with.
It really is like this big puzzle, this human puzzle they're trying to solve.
Yeah.
But okay, let's get practical here. What exactly do we mean when we say crowd safety?
Well, crowd safety is really focused on stopping accidents and injuries from happening within the crowd itself.
Okay.
So, like, think about things like crushes, stampedes, or situations where, people get trampled,
Right.
which is different from crowd security, which is more about protecting the crowd from, outside threats like terrorism or violence.
So two sides of the same coin, but different focuses.
Yeah, exactly.
And for this deep dive, we're mainly going to be looking at crowd safety. But, it's important to acknowledge that these crowd-related incidents, they do happen.
Yeah,
And the consequences can be really, really bad.
definitely.
I mean, we've got some pretty tragic examples in our research here, like that incident during the Hajj pilgrimage back in 2015.
Right.
Over 2,400 people died in a crowd crush.
Yeah, horrible tragedy. That really highlights how important it is to have a really effective crowd management.
Right.
And it's not always just one thing that leads to these disasters.
Yeah.
It's often this mix of things, like you might have overcrowding and then bad infrastructure that wasn't designed well, and then maybe poor communication on top of that.
Right. It all kind of snowballs.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to think about Hillsborough, too, in 1989. That crush during a football match in England.
Right.
96 people died.
Mm.
It really drives home how crucial it is to understand what can go wrong in these crowded spaces.
Absolutely.
And, more recently, we have tragedies like what happened at Astroworld Festival in 2021.
Yeah.
10 deaths, hundreds of injuries, really shows the need for constant vigilance.
Mm-hmm.
And for, crowd safety practices to keep getting better.
Yeah, it's an ongoing process for sure.
Now, we hear about these incidents, and they're often called a stampede or a crush. What's the real difference there?
So a stampede usually means the crowd is moving really fast and out of control, like
Okay.
a reaction to some perceived threat or a sudden rush towards something they all want.
Oh, I see.
While a crush is, well, that's when people are packed in so tight they literally can't move.
Right.
And that can lead to suffocation or, well, crushing injuries, obviously.
So both are super dangerous. But a crush, because of that tight compression, is a more immediate threat of actually suffocating.
Exactly. And understanding, the details of how these different incidents work is super important for actually figuring out how to keep people safe
Right.
and what to do if something does happen.
And those dangers, they can come from inside the crowd itself or for things outside the crowd. Right.
Yeah, for sure.
We saw the sources use these terms, intrinsic and extrinsic risks. Can you explain what they mean?
So intrinsic risks, those are the dangers that are just part of the crowd itself.
Okay.
Like how tightly packed they are, the potential for, those crushes or stampedes.
Right.
Even the psychology of how crowds behave, that can be a risk factor too.
So it's like just by having a huge number of people in a small space,
Yeah.
there's a built-in potential for danger.
Yeah, exactly. And then extrinsic risks, well, those are the dangers that come from outside the crowd.
Like what?
Well, think about the design of the venue, how much space there really is, where the exits are, or even something like the weather.
Right. You can't predict the weather always.
Yeah, like a sudden downpour or a heat wave can completely change how a crowd acts and make things dangerous.
And of course, we can't forget about those external threats like terrorism.
Yeah.
It's a sad reality that crowded spaces are, well, attractive targets for those kinds of attacks.
Sadly, yeah. Because of the potential for a lot of casualties and that, psychological impact,
Right.
it makes crowded places, yeah, they can be a target for those who want to cause harm.
It's tough trying to keep things secure without making public spaces feel, like fortresses.
It's a tricky balance for sure. Requires a lot of cooperation between, well, everyone involved.
Yeah.
Security, event organizers, even the people who design the buildings and the city planners.
Speaking of advancements,
Mm.
I'm really interested in this whole tech angle.
Oh, yeah.
Like, how's technology changing crowd safety?
Hmm.
We found sources talking about AI, sensors, even social media monitoring.
It's pretty amazing what's possible now.
Mm.
Imagine AI systems that can analyze those security camera feeds,
Yeah.
and they can spot if it's getting too crowded or even if someone is acting suspiciously.
So instead of just relying on people to watch everything, we've got AI doing some of that analysis. Wow.
Exactly. And it's not just AI. Sensors are playing a big role, too. They can collect all this real-time data, like temperature, air quality, how dense the crowd is.
Right.
That gives crowd managers so much more information to work with.
Yeah, it's like they've got this constant flow of information about what's happening so they can make better decisions and react faster.
Exactly. And this one might surprise you, but social media monitoring is becoming a really useful tool for crowd safety, too.
Really? Tell me more about that. I would have never thought of social media being used that way.
Well, think about it. When something happens in a crowd, where do people go? Social media, right.
Right.
They share information, talk about how they're feeling, sometimes even ask for help. So by keeping an eye on those social media feeds, crowd safety experts can get a real-time sense of what's going on.
Oh, that's
They
interesting.
can see potential problems as they're developing and even get a feel for the overall mood of the crowd.
Like they're tapping into the collective consciousness of the crowd or something.
Exactly. And then there's computer simulations.
Oh, yeah. Duh.
Those are really helpful for trying out different scenarios and strategies.
Like a virtual testing ground for crowd safety.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Researchers can create these virtual crowds and then simulate all kinds of things,
Right.
like evacuations, different types of emergencies, and that lets them test out how well different crowd management strategies work.
I see.
They can find potential weak spots in a safe environment before they actually have to deal with them in the real world.
That's pretty cool. Like a giant what-if machine for crowd safety.
Yeah, it's really powerful, helps them learn from past mistakes and be more proactive about preventing future disasters.
That made sense. But even with all this incredible technology, I think we have to remember that crowd safety isn't just about fancy tech solutions.
Definitely not.
It's about people being aware and prepared.
Absolutely. We need to move away from this idea that we're just passive bystanders in a crowd and start thinking more like active participants in keeping ourselves safe.
Right.
And that's where this idea of the zero responder comes in.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. Tell me more about that, about the zero responder and how everyday people can help.
So the zero responder is someone in the crowd who, with just a little bit of awareness and preparation,
Right.
can actually take action to help themselves and others before the professionals, the first responders, even get there.
So it's like being the first line of defense in a way.
Exactly. And it can be as basic as knowing where the exits are, staying hydrated, and not doing anything risky.
Okay.
But it can also mean more proactive things like telling security if you see something suspicious, or even knowing some basic first aid.
It's about moving away from that someone else will take care of it mindset and taking some ownership.
Exactly. It's a I can actually make a difference here mindset.
How do we encourage that kind of thinking?
Well, education is key. Like public awareness campaigns can help people understand basic crowd safety stuff.
Right.
Knowing those escape routes, staying hydrated, avoiding risky behavior, all that. And we could even include crowd safety in school curriculums, Start teaching this stuff early on.
That's a good idea. And of course, social media can be a great tool for spreading information and encouraging people to act responsibly.
Absolutely. It's about creating this whole culture of crowd safety awareness where people understand that their actions, even small ones, can have a real impact on the safety of everyone around them.
Yeah, it makes you think. Okay, let's finally dig into this Swiss cheese model of crowd safety.
All right, the cheese metaphor.
I'm ready to understand how Swiss cheese helps us understand crowd safety.
So imagine each slice of Swiss cheese as a different layer of protection in a crowd safety system.
Okay.
You've got laws and regulations, the planning and risk assessment that happens beforehand, how things are controlled during the event, how prepared the community is, and then the emergency response plan.
So each slice is like a different aspect of how crowds are managed. But what about those holes in the Swiss cheese?
Ah, yes, the holes. Those represent the weaknesses, the
Mm,
potential for things to go wrong in each layer.
right,
No system is perfect, so these holes, they're gonna be there.
right.
But the idea is that with multiple layers of protection, those holes are less likely to line up, you know,
Oh, I see.
and that reduces the risk of something really bad happening.
So it's like having a safety net with a bunch of layers.
Yeah,
Even if one layer has some holes, the others can still catch things and prevent a total system failure.
exactly. And that's why the Swiss cheese model is so useful. It shows us that crowd safety is everyone's responsibility.
Okay.
It's not just on the organizers or the authorities.
Right.
It involves everyone, from the people who make the rules to the security staff to the individuals in the crowd.
And it highlights how interconnected everything is, right?
Yeah.
All these layers working together to create a stronger safety net.
And it shows how important it is to keep evaluating and strengthening each layer, trying to make those holes smaller so they're less likely to line up in a way that leads to disaster.
This model is such a good way to visualize how having that multi-layered approach can really make a difference.
It's a helpful way to think about both, when things go well and when things go wrong.
Yeah.
By figuring out which specific holes contributed to a problem,
Right.
we can learn from those mistakes and make our systems better to prevent similar problems from happening again.
It's like when investigators look at those near collisions in aviation.
Uh-huh.
They study those to improve safety and prevent crashes.
Exactly.
And the key is to see those close calls not as failures, but as learning opportunities. Yeah.
Absolutely. Being open and honest about those near misses is how we can all learn and get better at this.
It's about creating that culture of transparency where people feel comfortable speaking up when something almost went wrong.
Right, so we can all learn from those close calls and take steps to prevent something worse from happening.
Okay, so we've covered a lot so far. We've talked about how crowds behave, the layers of the Swiss cheese model, and how tech is changing things.
Yeah.
But there's more. Our sources, some other really interesting stuff that I think our listeners will want to hear about. And we'll get to that in part 2. Welcome back to our deep dive into crowd safety. Before the break, we were talking about how the Swiss cheese model helps us understand crowd safety as a system with all these different layers of protection.
Right.
We left off talking about how each slice of Swiss cheese is like a different layer, and how those holes represent places where things could potentially go wrong. So let's break down each layer and see how it works in practice, in the real world.
Okay, sounds good.
We can start with legislation and regulations.
Right.
This layer, it's like the foundation, right?
Yeah, it sets those minimum safety standards that everyone involved has to follow.
Right.
Whether you're organizing an event or managing a crowd, these are the rules you got to stick to.
So things like building codes, fire safety rules, guidelines for how many people can be in a space and how many exits there need to be.
Exactly. Think of it like a safety baseline, those ground rules that are there to prevent tragedies from happening.
So these regulations might say how wide exits have to be, or if fire extinguishers are required, or even if you need a detailed plan for what to do in an emergency.
Yeah, and they're not just suggestions,
Right.
They're legal requirements.
But as we've talked about, even with these regulations, things can still slip through the cracks.
Yeah, that's why we need those other layers to catch those potential problems before they get out of control.
Right, those holes in our Swiss cheese. And they can show up in unexpected places.
For sure.
Imagine a situation where a venue technically has enough exits, but they're not clearly marked or they're hard to get to in a real emergency.
Right. That's a hole in the legislation layer.
Or maybe a venue was designed, a long time ago
Yeah.
before we really understood some of these crowd safety ideas. So
Yeah,
there might be a gap between what the rules require and what's considered best practice today.
definitely. And that's where the next layer comes in, pre-planning and risk assessment.
So this is where organizers go beyond those basic regulations and really think about the specific risks that their event or venue might have.
Absolutely. They look at everything from how many people they expect and who those people are
Okay.
to the layout of the space, even the weather. They even think about what kind of event it is, like what the mood might be like, so they can anticipate problems.
So it's about being proactive
Yeah.
and tailoring your approach to the specific event.
Precisely. And this kind of planning, it often involves a lot of different experts working together.
Oh, like who?
Security people, emergency responders, architects, engineers. It's about getting different perspectives to make a really comprehensive safety plan.
It sounds pretty complex, almost like planning a huge performance or something.
You could say that. Effective planning means figuring out how the crowd might move, finding those potential bottlenecks where things could get jammed up, and then coming up with strategies to deal with those risks.
So they might create specific areas for different activities or put up barriers to guide people or even change the layout of the venue to make it safer.
Exactly.
But even with the best planning, things can change during the event itself, right?
Yeah, for sure.
That's where operational control comes in.
Right. Operational control is all about managing the crowd in real time,
Okay.
adapting to changes, making those decisions on the fly that can make all the difference. Think of it like the boots on the ground part of crowd safety.
So this is the security guards, the ushers, everyone who's interacting with the crowd and making sure things are running smoothly.
Yep. They're the ones who are constantly monitoring how crowded it's getting, directing people to exits, responding to incidents, and talking to each other to stay on top of what's happening.
They're putting those pre-planned strategies into action, but also reacting to how the crowd is actually behaving.
Exactly. It's like conducting an orchestra, but with thousands of people instead of instruments.
Right. Effective operational control. It requires clear communication, quick thinking, and being able to handle those unexpected things that always seem to happen at big events.
Definitely. And even with well-trained people, there's always the chance of human error or something happening that no one could have predicted.
And that's why our Swiss cheese has yet another layer to catch those potential problems. We've talked about regulations, planning, and operational control. What's the next slice in our crowd safety cheese board?
The next layer focuses on something we haven't really talked about in depth yet. It's about individual awareness and community preparedness.
Okay.
It's recognizing that crowd safety isn't just the responsibility of the organizers or the authorities. It's something we all have a role to play in.
I'm really interested to hear more about this. How can everyday people actually make a difference when it comes to crowd safety?
Well, remember the concept of the zero responder we talked about earlier?
Right, the person in the crowd who can take action before the professionals arrive.
Exactly. It's about empowering people to be aware of what's going on around them, to recognize potential dangers, and to take action even before trained professionals get there.
So it's not just knowing where the exits are, but actually being able to assess the situation and maybe even intervene if something doesn't seem right.
Right. It could be something as simple as telling security if you see someone acting strangely or if you notice an exit is blocked. Or it could mean helping others get to safety if there's a sudden commotion, or even knowing some basic first aid if someone gets hurt.
It's about moving away from being a passive bystander and taking a more proactive, engaged approach to safety. But how do we encourage that shift? How do we empower people to become those zero responders?
Well, like we talked about before, education is key. Public awareness campaigns can help inform people about basic crowd safety principles, things like knowing evacuation routes, staying hydrated, and avoiding risky behavior.
Right.
And we could even integrate crowd safety into school curriculums, Start
Mhm.
teaching this stuff early on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And social media can also be a really powerful tool for spreading information and encouraging people to behave responsibly in crowds.
Absolutely. It's about creating this whole culture of crowd safety awareness, where people understand that their actions, even small ones, can have a real impact on the safety of everyone around them. And this brings us to our final layer of protection, the emergency response plan.
So this is the layer that kicks in if those other layers fail and something actually happens.
Exactly. The emergency response plan outlines exactly what to do in all kinds of situations, from medical emergencies to evacuations to security threats. It involves coordinating with first responders, communicating with the crowd, and helping those who need it.
So it's like the last line of defense when things go wrong.
It's definitely a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it's important to remember that how well an emergency response plan works depends a lot on those previous layers.
Right.
If the initial planning was poor, or the operational control was weak, or the community wasn't prepared, even the best emergency response plan can only do so much.
It's like trying to put out a fire that's already out of control.
Yeah.
It's much better to prevent the fire from starting in the first place.
Exactly. And that's what the Swiss cheese model shows us so well.
Yeah.
Crowd safety is a whole system where each layer depends on the ones before it.
Right.
To create a truly safe environment, we need to minimize risks at every stage, from the initial planning all the way down to the choices that individuals make within the crowd.
So it's not just about one person or one measure being responsible for crowd safety. It's a shared responsibility that requires everyone to work together and use a multi-layered approach.
Exactly. And that's why understanding models like the Swiss cheese model is so valuable. They give us a way to analyze and improve our crowd safety practices by showing us how all these different layers of protection are connected.
It really drives home the point that crowd safety is a team effort. We all have a part to play in creating a safer environment for ourselves and everyone around us.
Yeah, it's not just about following the rules. It's about being aware, being proactive, and being willing to help out. It's about being those zero responders who can make a real difference in those critical moments.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of crowd safety, and I think you'll find this last part especially interesting. We're going to go a little deeper, beyond the nuts and bolts, to some less obvious but equally important aspects of this whole field.
We're going to tackle some common myths about crowd behavior, see what we can learn from those near misses, and even get into a kind of controversial concept called the value of statistical life.
Ooh, sounds philosophical.
Yep.
But first, those myths, those persistent myths about crowd safety. You know those I'm talking about, the ones
Yeah.
that make it seem like crowds are just chaos waiting to happen.
Right, crowds are just inherently prone to panic. Everyone's going to lose their minds.
Exactly.
While those scenarios can happen, of course, they're not always the norm. Research actually suggests that people in crowds, they can be remarkably resilient.
Oh, interesting.
They cooperate, even in emergencies.
So it's not always a every man for himself situation.
Not at all. People often help each other out, they follow instructions, and there's a surprising amount of order, even when things are tough. The problem is, those times when it does go wrong, those dramatic incidents, they get all the attention.
Right. It's those big stories that make the news.
Exactly. And they overshadow all the times when crowds are actually pretty calm and collected.
That makes sense. It's like focusing on those few plane crashes while ignoring the thousands of safe flights every day.
Exactly. And another misconception is that crowds are all the same, that everyone's going to react the same way to something.
Right. Our sources talked about how important it is to recognize the diversity within a crowd. If you just assume everyone's going to behave the same, you're going to end up with crowd management strategies that just don't work.
Exactly. Like imagine planning an evacuation, assuming everyone's going to move at the same speed or understand instructions the same way.
Right.
In reality, you've got people of all ages, different abilities, cultural backgrounds, and even how familiar they are with the place matters.
Failing to account for that, that could create bottlenecks, confusion, and ultimately make things more dangerous.
Exactly. To manage crowds effectively, you have to recognize and adapt to those individual differences. You need a system that can handle a variety of responses and help those who might need extra support.
Okay, so we've busted a couple of crowd myths. What about learning from those incidents that almost happened? Our sources talked about studying those near misses.
Near misses, those are those times when a disaster was this close to happening.
Right.
They're incredibly valuable. They give us insight into potential weaknesses in the system without anyone actually getting hurt.
It's like a warning sign, a chance to fix a problem before it becomes a disaster.
Exactly. By analyzing near misses, we can find those holes in our Swiss cheese, those places where planning, communication, or control might have broken down. And by fixing those weaknesses, we can strengthen our systems and reduce the likelihood of it happening again.
It reminds me of how investigators analyze those near collisions in aviation, to improve safety procedures and prevent accidents.
That's a great analogy. And the key is to see these new misses not as failures, but as opportunities to learn and get better.
It's about creating that environment where people feel comfortable reporting near misses so that everyone can learn from them.
Right. Open discussion and analysis. That's how we identify those vulnerabilities and put preventative measures in place. Okay, ready to tackle a more challenging concept?
Hit me with it.
The value of statistical life.
This one, I admit, it took me a while to really get.
It often sparks debate and can seem a little counterintuitive at first.
It's basically a way to quantify the economic benefit of preventing a death, right? Like it's used to figure out if safety measures are cost-effective and make decisions about where to spend money.
Exactly. And it's important to understand that we're not talking about putting an actual dollar value on a human life. That would be ethically wrong, obviously. Instead, it's about recognizing that, as a society, we're willing to invest resources to prevent deaths. And this concept gives us a way to make those investment decisions more rationally based on data.
So, for example, if we're thinking about installing a new safety feature at a stadium, we could use the value of statistical life to estimate how many lives that feature might save over time,
Yeah,
and then compare that to the cost of installing it.
exactly. It helps us balance the potential benefits of a safety measure with the economic cost. Of course, ethical considerations are always part of the equation, but this concept gives us a way to support investments in safety that might otherwise seem too expensive.
So it highlights that even though we can't put a price tag on a human life, we can use data and analysis to make better decisions about how to protect people.
It's about recognizing that every life has value and that we have a responsibility to invest in measures that reduce the risk of preventable deaths.
This deep dive into crowd safety has been fascinating. We've explored how crowds behave, those layers of protection in the Swiss cheese model, and the role of technology in keeping crowds safe.
We've seen how a multi-layered approach can help us create a more robust safety net.
And learned that crowd safety isn't just the responsibility of experts or authorities.
Huh?
It's something we all have a part to play in.
Whether you're organizing an event, working security, or just attending a large gathering, being aware of your surroundings, making smart choices, and even taking small actions to help others can make a real difference.
Crowd safety, it's a shared responsibility. By combining knowledge, technology, and that proactive mindset, we can make those experiences safer and more enjoyable for everyone.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of crowd safety. We hope you learned something new and maybe even gained a new perspective on this complex and important field. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.